This is a little bit of an experiment really. What I've got here, these are reclaimed or reused plastic paper trays from a school. So the school was throwing out loads of these containers. They're slightly larger than A4, and I'm using these as sort of wicking reservoir trays underneath these mushroom crates. And what I quite like is growing on plants, especially from sort of when I'm growing from seed, and you end up with lots of little pots around about sort of 4-inch 100mm pots. It's keeping all those watered, and what I found is with this sort of system I can actually grow quite a lot of quite large plants on just in containers on top of these same sort of capillary sort of wicking trays. And what I quite liked is the idea of the plant roots growing through from the pot and then into this sort of feeding station itself. But what I've got here, so what I've done here is I make lots of biochar. So this is basically just charcoal, but it's charcoal used with a specific use as a sort of soil amendment. But really, largely what I'm doing here is trying to use the charcoal as a sort of almost an activated sort of filter. So it takes up excess nitrates that wash through from the soil feeding stations in these mushroom crates. I've got all sorts of different combinations of using these sort of wicking containers and wicking reservoirs, but this is quite a sort of shallow one, and I tend to use this more of a sort of seed tray. But what I've got here, you can see that it's just these are just some sort of leaf litter. I've just laid that down on here, and then there's some shredded cardboard. So what I'm really trying to do with this, I've got the level in the tray, the water in the irrigation tray, and then this is actually a capillary, a polythene permeable sort of punched, or sort of, it's got little tiny holes. I don't think you're going to be able to see on the camera, but it's sort of perforated every maybe 4 or 5 millimeters in a like little grid. So it's got little tiny holes. So the idea is you've got wicking fabric underneath there, which tends to be wool, and then the pot plants sit on it, and what that does is it just acts as a little mulch. It covers over and it stops evaporation. But if you press on there, you can kind of see the water is actually in that wicking material underneath. But what I found, I mean, the best sort of method of moving moisture up from here is sort of plant roots of sort of bog kind of plants. And so in the reservoir itself you have more of an ecosystem, so it's not just water that sits there. And what I was experimenting with is just using charcoal. So I've got loads of charcoal under there, so it's basically full of charcoal. That was quite dry because I just quenched it when I just made that, and I've dampened it down. But most of that water will evaporate off as steam. So what I'm doing here is just sort of set this one up. And my theory is if you've got soil feeding, there are actually worms on here. If you've got a soil feeding station on top, if the worms go down into that tray, there's a big red wiggler there, so I'll just put him back on the plant. Where's he gone? He's quite lively. So we'll go into that one. So yes, I'm going to sort of say, if that was just a reservoir, the worms drop down into there, they're kind of not going to be able to get out. So basically I've got this biochar, so that makes like little kind of islands, and then the idea is that's activated by any excess sort of leachate or nitrates that wash through. But largely it's really, so you've got this charcoal taking up that moisture, retaining that moisture, and kind of creating that micro sort of or kind of habitat underneath there, so the worms can go in there, they can feed on the charcoal, they'll survive really well in that sort of damp, moist conditions with the nitrates that are washing through from the container above. And yeah, for some reason they really go to town on this stuff. I've kept this fairly large pieces. I just crushed it with a bit of 4x2 in a galvanised bucket. But from my point of view, in terms of using this as a bulking agent, I think sort of long term, if you've got a nice good sort of quality topsoil that's been cultivated and amended, and you've got organic matter and there's a nice balance of soil life, I think the really fine powders and much smaller particles work better. But I think if you're starting off with really heavy clay soil and you really just want to add moisture retention and drainage and aeration, then the bigger chunks work really well. But they say that charcoal, it holds about 3 times its weight in water. So I think this is probably, yeah, you can see at the moment that's actually floating. So what I quite like about that is these are like little islands. So as the water goes up and down, there's going to be some transfer from moisture and movement and aeration through the charcoal itself. So maybe a bit kind of like an iceberg, about 75% to be underwater, and then you've got that sort of 25% that's above water but wicking water up. And then when the plants take up that moisture, the water level drops down, but that charcoal is helping to circulate that water around. So it's not just standing there stagnant, it's kind of moving. And obviously with plastic as well, as you get day and night time temperature fluctuations, you get kind of condensation and movement in that capillary tray as well. So that's the sort of theory, and if nothing else, that will work as an activated filter anyway, so that will take up those nitrates. But I've tried this before, and what is really interesting is that charcoal will stay moist for months and months. And what it is, because that, if you imagine that tree has got all those sort of cell structure and all those little open pores and tubes in there, and this is mainly sort of softwood, so it's got quite a coarse grain. It's not a really kind of dense grain hardwood. And you can see how that crushes up and sort of almost sort of squashes down. As that becomes more activated, I've noticed that it kind of becomes more like a foam, and you can really sort of squish it and squash it, and you can see that the water's actually oozing out from that already, but it's still buoyant. So I think that's quite a good way of moving that moisture around and holding it there, so you're not just having a little shallow tray of moisture in the bottom of these capillary trays. But what I'm trying to do here as well, in a way, this is sort of reminiscent of what happens in the soil in terms of capillary action through the topsoil, water retention in the topsoil, but then also in the capillary tray, which would be like almost like the water table. So there'd be that movement and transfer of moisture from down and through the sort of soil life. But yeah, that's the kind of process that I'm working on. It's worked quite well. So what I've done here, this is a reclaimed acrylic offcut from a laser cutter that was in their scrap bin, and I've cut those out just crudely, and I've got holes around the edge as well and holes through here so the moisture can kind of permeate down. But this is just water forget-me-not, and I just sort of thought I'd have a little container of that in there just to get down to the bottom of the leachate and to sort of take that moisture up from there. And then I've made another little planter pocket here, and I'm going to laser cut these and make router templates so I can kind of produce them much easier, and then I'll have one on each corner. So I just wanted something that was going to root down in there. Not really sure what species of plants. That was just water forget-me-not, because it's quite pretty and it flowers and it's quite attractive. But yeah, it's really creating more of a root zone down in the irrigation tray. And then rather than using capillary matting, I was thinking of using organic matter and then having the soil feeding stations on top. I don't know if I can lift that one-handed. Yeah, so something like this. So this is basically like a kind of wormery with a buffer zone as well. So you've got a place for the worms to move out into if they've kind of too much food going or too much feed going on in here. But I've set these up just recently, so there's not a huge worm population in these, but there's similar things where I've set these up on a green roof and they've been around in use for about a year. There's a real nice population of worms and some really kind of big red wigglers in there as well. And I've found that the favourite place they like to habit is just on top of that capillary tray underneath the actual soil feeding station, where it's the most sort of concentration of moisture and there's kind of leachate in there. And then on top of the feeding station, up directly underneath the plants. So what I've done here, this is just a little kind of one of my green roof lids, and that fits on top like that. And these are just reclaimed materials, but what is really nice is once these are sort of activated and charged up, there's lots of soil life on here. So if you've got a pot plant, even in just kind of ordinary compost, there's an additional kind of nitrates and elements in that breaking down organic matter to kind of replenish what's being used up by the plants as they grow. So you can sustain a lot of plant growth in a really small pot, because the plant will outgrow that pot. It won't become root bound, it'll actually root down into all this sort of organic matter around the base. So if you're growing things like sunflowers or sort of annuals where you just want to grow them over a season, These sort of things are really great, and I've got the same sort of container as this, as a reservoir bucket, and just have one of these as a sort of shallow tray with a layer of organic matter, and then that becomes a really nice sort of capillary wicking bed, and then you can stand the pots on there. And if the sides of that come up higher, if you get sort of 4 pots, one in the middle, or 5 pots, one in the middle, and then 4 around in each corner, they'll sort of hold each other up as well. So that's the plan. So I'll sort of show how this works.